The rehab facility's front desk phone rang through to my cell at 4:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a med pass on my own unit 2 towns over. It was the discharge coordinator, a kind, tired-sounding woman named Priya, telling me that my father had been sitting in the lobby in his wheelchair for exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes, his single-packed duffel bag zipped and resting across his knees, waiting for a pickup that had never come. She read me the name on the discharge paperwork under responsible party for transport. Not my brother Holt, who had promised in writing, in a text message I still have, that he would be there at 1:00 sharp. Not my sister Vanessa, who had CC'd herself onto every single email from the care team for the past 6 weeks specifically so it would look, to anyone glancing at the thread, like she was involved. My name. Rosalind Kessler, home health nurse, 40 minutes away, still in scrubs, still holding a med cup for someone else's father. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about the family I grew up in. Nobody had called Holt. Nobody had called Vanessa. Priya had simply looked at the intake sheet, found the one name attached to a phone number that always answered, and dialed it. That was 6 months before the morning I finally understood exactly how much my brother and sister had actually taken from him, and by then, understanding it wasn't nearly enough. I had to prove it. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where family secrets come to light and quiet people find their voice. If stories about standing your ground speak to you, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe so you never miss one. My name is Rosalind Kessler. I'm 39 years old, and for 14 years I've worked as a home health and hospice nurse, which means I've spent my entire career watching families show up for their people, or more often, watching them very carefully arrange to be somewhere else. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly what my father lost, and exactly what my siblings gained, before I can tell you what happened the day I finally sat across from a county probate judge with a folder 2 inches thick and my father's shaking hand in mine. I have to take you back almost 18 months, to the night my father, Walter Kessler, fell in the bathroom of the house he'd lived in for 31 years, the house where my mother had died 4 years earlier in the back bedroom with the good afternoon light. He was 76 then, a retired postal carrier, a man who had walked the same 6-mile route through our town for 29 years and still out of habit, woke at 5:30 every morning whether he had anywhere to walk or not. He'd had a small stroke 11 months before that fall, a mild one, the kind that leaves a person mostly themselves but a little slower, a little more likely to lose the thread of a sentence halfway through it, a little more likely to ask you the same question twice in one conversation and not notice he'd asked it before. The bathroom fall was worse. He hit his head on the edge of the tub, lay there for close to 6 hours before a neighbor noticed his newspaper still sitting on the porch at noon. And by the time paramedics got him to the hospital, he had a subdural hematoma that required emergency surgery, and a level of confusion afterward that the neurologist, a careful, unhurried man named Dr. Okonkwo, described to us in the family conference room with a specific phrase I have never once forgotten. "Your father is going to need a level of support now that he didn't need 3 days ago," he said. "And I want to be honest with you, the confusion may not fully resolve. We're looking at what's likely early vascular dementia, probably accelerated significantly by this bleed. This is going to be a long road." I want to describe that family conference room exactly as it was, because I think the seating arrangement told you everything about what was coming. My brother Holt, 43, a real estate developer who had spent the better part of the previous decade building and losing and rebuilding a series of increasingly ambitious commercial projects, each one financed by increasingly aggressive debt, sat closest to the door, his phone face up on his knee, glancing at it every few minutes in a way that made it clear some part of his attention had never actually left whatever deal he was currently juggling. My sister Vanessa, 36, who ran a boutique event planning and floral design business out of a rented storefront downtown, sat beside him, her eyes red-rimmed and genuinely wet, dabbing at them with a folded tissue in a way that I want to be fair and say I believe, in that specific moment, was real grief. I sat across from both of them, in scrubs, because I had come straight from a shift, my own eyes dry, because dry eyes are a professional skill I'd built over 14 years of family conference rooms just like this one. Except this was the first time I'd ever sat on the family side of the table instead of the care team side. Dr. Okonkwo laid out what the coming months would likely require. Cognitive rehabilitation, a structured, predictable environment, regular medical follow-up, eventually, probably, some level of either in-home care or assisted living, depending on how his recovery trajectory went. He looked, as he said all this, mostly at me, because I think he'd clocked within about 4 minutes of that meeting exactly which of the 3 adult children in that room actually understood what any of the words he was using meant, and exactly which 2 were going to need considerably more of it translated into smaller sentences later. I want to be honest about what happened over the following weeks, because I think the shape of it matters enormously for understanding everything that came after. There was, in that first month, a real and genuine flurry of family concern. Holt visited twice a week. Vanessa brought flowers to the rehab facility and posted a photograph of them, artfully arranged, captioned with a heart and the words, "Sending my dad all my love during this scary time." A post that generated, I noticed later, considerably more engagement than any of her actual client work that month. I understood, even then, that some of what I was watching was genuine love filtered through people who simply didn't know what to do with their hands when love required something other than a gesture. What I did not understand yet, what I would not understand for months, was that underneath the flowers and the visits, a considerably less sentimental calculation was already quietly underway. Here is something I need to explain about my family's specific architecture, because I think it will feel familiar to some of you watching this. Growing up, I was, in my mother's specific and repeated phrase, the sensible one. Holt was the golden one, charming, ambitious, the kind of kid who could talk his way out of a parent-teacher conference and somehow leave the teacher thanking him for coming in. Vanessa was the delicate one, artistic, easily overwhelmed, the one whose meltdowns my mother managed with the careful, practiced patience of a woman diffusing something fragile. I was the one nobody managed, because I never seemed to need managing. I got good grades without being asked. I got a nursing degree without anyone paying for a single credit hour of it, working 2 jobs through school the way you do, when your family's limited emotional and financial resources have already been allocated elsewhere. I moved 40 minutes away instead of staying in town, not out of any dramatic rejection of my family, but simply because that's where the job was, and nobody in my family had ever once, in 39 years, treated my geographic distance as anything other than a minor scheduling inconvenience they were entitled to override whenever it suited them. So when my father needed someone, the family's instinct reached for me the same way Priya's discharge clipboard had automatically, without much discussion, because I was the name that had always answered. The first 6 weeks after his fall went, by everyone's account, reasonably well. My father moved through acute rehab and into a longer-term cognitive rehabilitation unit, and I drove out to see him 3, sometimes 4 times a week, on top of my own full patient caseload, because that is simply what I do. That is the shape my life has always taken, and because some stubborn part of me still believed, then, that showing up consistently enough would eventually be matched by my siblings showing up consistently too. The way effort is supposed to work in families that function the way families are supposed to function. It was at exactly the 6-week mark, at a follow-up meeting with the facility's discharge planner, that I first heard the word that would come to define the following year of my life: guardianship. Not a formal court-ordered guardianship, not yet. The discharge planner, a brisk, practical woman named Fatima, was simply raising the question of who, specifically, was going to be my father's healthcare proxy and financial decision-maker once he was discharged, given his ongoing cognitive impairment. "Does your father have an existing power of attorney?" she asked, looking around the table at the 3 of us. I did not know the answer to that question. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I assumed, if such a document existed, it would name all 3 of us jointly, or perhaps name me specifically, given that I was the one with medical training and the one who had, by that point, spent 6 weeks driving out 3 times a week. I was wrong on both counts, though I would not learn exactly how wrong for several more months. Holt answered first, with the easy, reassuring confidence that had always made rooms trust him faster than they should have. "Dad set that up years ago, actually," he said. "After Mom passed, I've got it handled." He said it in a tone that closed the subject, the specific tone of a man who has decided a conversation is over before anyone else has had the chance to weigh in. And I remember, sitting there, feeling a small, easily dismissed prick of unease, the kind you learn, in a family like mine, to swallow rather than voice, because voicing it would have meant accusing my own brother of something I had no actual evidence for yet, and because some old, deeply worn groove in my personality still assumed, at that point, that Holt handling something meant it was, in fact, handled. I did not think about that moment again for nearly 4 months. I want you to hold on to that timeline because it matters. My father was discharged from the rehabilitation facility in early spring, into a level of independence that Dr. Okonkwo had carefully, repeatedly cautioned us was not going to be sustainable long-term without significant support. He could manage basic daily tasks with supervision, but his short-term memory was unreliable enough that he genuinely could not be trusted alone with medication management, with his finances, with anything requiring him to remember accurately. From one day to the next, what he had already done or agreed to. The discharge plan called for either a home health aide several days a week or a move into an assisted living facility with a memory care component, and it called, explicitly, in writing, for one of his 3 adult children to hold and actively use power of attorney to manage his affairs, given his diminished capacity. I offered, at that discharge meeting, to have him come stay with me. I want to explain why I offered this, because I think it says something about who I am that matters for the rest of this story. I am not a martyr, and I want to push back gently against anyone who's thinking, watching this, that I'm about to describe myself as one. I offered because I am a nurse, because I understood, professionally and specifically, exactly what my father needed and exactly how to provide it, and because some part of me, the part that had spent 14 years watching other families fail to show up for their own people, simply could not bear the thought of my father becoming one more patient whose family had quietly, gradually, made itself scarce. Holt, at that same meeting, made a counteroffer, delivered with the specific warmth he reserved for moments when he needed a room to agree with him quickly. Dad should come stay with him and his wife, he said, just for a little while, just to get settled, in their considerably larger house across town, closer to his old neighborhood, closer to his old friends, an arrangement that made a certain surface-level sense, and that I, still operating on the assumption that my brother's offer reflected genuine intention rather than strategic positioning, did not fight hard against. I want to be honest that I have spent a great deal of time since then turning over exactly why Holt wanted my father under his own roof rather than mine, and I no longer believe, given everything I eventually learned, that it had anything to do with proximity to old friends. What it gave him, specifically and immediately, was physical custody of the one asset that made every subsequent piece of this story possible. Unsupervised, unquestioned, daily access to a man whose signature could now be obtained on almost anything, at almost any time, by anyone patient enough to pick the right moment and phrase the right sentence. My father moved into Holt's house in April. I drove out every weekend I could manage, which, given my own patient caseload, was most weekends, though I want to be honest that most is not all. And there were 3 or 4 weekends across that spring and summer where a double shift or a dying patient of my own kept me away. Weekends I would, months later, comb back through with a specific, sickening precision, trying to reconstruct exactly what might have happened during the gaps. What I noticed, across those visits, gradually, in the specific way you notice things when you're too close to a situation to trust your own instincts yet, was a series of small, individually explainable oddities. My father, on several visits, mentioned the papers Holt had him sign, always vaguely, always in the confused, slightly apologetic tone he developed since the stroke when he sensed he was supposed to remember something and couldn't. When I asked Holt about it, he was breezy, dismissive, the same closing the subject tone from the discharge meeting. Just POA stuff, Rose, standard paperwork. You know how this works. I did not, in fact, know exactly how it worked, not from the inside, not as someone actually holding power of attorney. And I want to be honest that this gap in my own knowledge, a gap Holt, whether consciously or not, was actively exploiting, is a large part of why it took me as long as it did to understand what was actually happening. If you've ever had a small, dismissible detail sit wrong in your stomach for months before you finally had the evidence to explain why, you already know exactly the particular unease that followed me through that entire spring and summer. Stay with me, because what I found in my father's mail 8 months later is not something I could have imagined sitting in that discharge meeting. Hit subscribe so you don't lose this before I get to the bank statements. The house went up for sale in July. I want to describe exactly how I found out, because the mechanics of it tell you everything about how carefully this had already been arranged before I ever caught wind of it. I was driving past my parents' old street, my father's street, the house where I'd grown up, the house with the back bedroom where my mother had died, on my way to a patient visit in the same neighborhood, a coincidence of geography that had nothing to do with any suspicion on my part. And I saw, staked in the front yard, a realtor's sign with a bright red sold banner slapped diagonally across it. I pulled over. I sat in my car in front of the house I had grown up in, looking at a sold sign nobody in my family had mentioned to me, and I felt something shift in my chest that I recognize now, with considerable hindsight, as the exact moment my trust in my brother's account of handling it, finally, fully broke. I called Holt from that curb. He answered on the second ring, and when I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, why the house had been sold without a single word to me, his explanation arrived smooth and immediate, in a way that told me, even in the moment, that he'd had this explanation prepared and waiting for exactly this eventuality. "Dad wasn't going back there, Rose," he said. "You know that. The house was just sitting there, taxes piling up, upkeep costs, insurance. It made sense to liquidate it and put the money somewhere it could actually help him. I've been managing it. Don't worry about the details, I've got it under control." I asked directly where the proceeds from the sale had gone. There was a pause on the line, brief but long enough that I noticed it, the specific pause of someone recalculating how much of an actual answer a question deserves. "Into an account for his care," Holt said. "It's handled, Rose. I don't need you auditing every decision I make for Dad. You visit on weekends. I'm the one dealing with this every single day." I want to be honest about how effective that line was on me, in that specific moment, sitting in my car outside the house I'd grown up in. It landed hard, on exactly the insecurity my family had spent 39 years cultivating in me. The sensible one, the one who shows up but doesn't get to decide. The one whose competence was always assumed but whose actual authority was never once, across an entire childhood, formally granted. I let the call end without pushing further. I drove to my patient visit. I did my job. And that night, alone in my apartment, I sat with a feeling I couldn't yet name. A feeling that I understand now, looking back, was the specific, disorienting sensation of my own professional instincts. The instincts that had caught 100 small inconsistencies in 100 other family stories over 14 years, trying to get my attention about my own family, and being told, by the exact same trained deference I'd spent a lifetime building toward my brother, to stand down. I did not stand down for much longer. What changed everything? What finally gave me the one piece of leverage I needed to stop deferring and start documenting, arrived 3 weeks later, through my father himself, in the specific, heartbreaking way that early dementia sometimes hands you the truth sideways, through repetition rather than clarity. I had taken my father out for lunch, one of our standing Saturday routines, to the same diner he'd eaten breakfast at most mornings during his postal route for nearly 3 decades, a place where the waitresses still called him Mr. Walter and brought his coffee without being asked. He was, that particular Saturday, having what I'd learned to recognize as a clearer day. His sentences held together more consistently, his eyes tracked with more of their old sharpness, the kind of day where I could sometimes catch a genuine, unclouded glimpse of the man he'd been before the fall. Partway through lunch, apropos of very little, he set down his fork and looked at me with an expression I recognized instantly as worry, real worry, cutting through the fog. "Holt keeps bringing me papers," he said. "He says it's about the house, but Rosalind, I don't remember signing for it to be sold. I remember him showing me something, and I remember his hand on mine, guiding the pen because my hand was shaking that day. But I don't remember agreeing to sell your mother's house. I sat very still in that diner booth, holding my father's hand across a table sticky with 30 years of accumulated syrup rings, and felt something in me go permanently, coldly clear. My hand was shaking that day, and Holt guided the pen. I have spent my entire career reading exactly this kind of sentence in exactly this kind of context, in patient charts, in family disputes, in the careful, clinical language of elder abuse assessments I have personally written for other families' fathers. I recognized it instantly for what it was, even wrapped in my own father's confused, apologetic phrasing. I did not react, in that diner, the way I wanted to. I did not confront him about it, because confronting a man with early dementia about a memory he's already unsure of rarely produces anything but more confusion and more shame. Instead, I did the thing I have always done, the thing 14 years of charting patient histories has made entirely automatic. I asked him gently, carefully, to tell me again, slowly, everything he remembered about that day, and I wrote it down, word for word, in the notes app on my phone, right there at the table, dated, time-stamped, in his own words as closely as I could capture them. That was the first entry in what would become, over the following 7 months, a folder considerably thicker than anything I'd ever built for a patient. I want to walk you through what I did next, methodically, because I think the specific texture of it matters more than any single dramatic confrontation. I did not call Holt and accuse him of anything. I understood, even in that first cold, clear moment in the diner, that an accusation without documentation would simply hand my brother the exact same deflecting, dismissive script he'd already used successfully on me once. Instead, I began, quietly, patiently, gathering. I started with something entirely within my own legal rights to request. My father's medical records from the period around the house sale, specifically any notes regarding his cognitive status, his capacity assessments, and any documentation of his mental state on the specific date the sale documents were signed. As a healthcare proxy, because it turned out, when I finally pushed to see the actual power of attorney document Holt had been so breezy about, that I was, in fact, listed as secondary healthcare decision-maker, though not financial, a detail Holt had conveniently never mentioned. I had a legal right to request this. Dr. Okonkwo's office pulled the relevant chart notes, and what I found, cross-referenced against the closing date of the house sale, made my stomach turn. 3 weeks before the sale closed, my father had undergone a routine cognitive screening as part of his ongoing dementia monitoring, and the documented score placed him solidly in a range the neurologist's own notes described as significant impairment in decision-making capacity regarding complex financial matters. 3 weeks. The sale had closed while that exact assessment sat in his chart, unread or ignored by whoever had walked him through a real estate closing. I found the power of attorney document itself next, requesting a copy through the attorney's office listed on the paperwork, a small local firm I did not recognize, rather than the family attorney who had handled my parents' affairs for decades, and who I would have expected, if this had been done properly, to be involved. The document had been executed, I learned, in a rushed signing at Holt's kitchen table, witnessed by 2 people I had never met, employees. It turned out, of Holt's own real estate development company, a detail that struck me, once I understood it, as a specific, calculated choice, since witnesses with a professional relationship to the person benefiting from a document are exactly the kind of witnesses a careful attorney would never allow near a legitimate elder care power of attorney. The financial trail, once I started pulling threads, unraveled with a speed that genuinely frightened me. I want to be honest that some of what I found required a level of access I want to be transparent about. I did not hack into anything. I did not access accounts I had no legal right to see. What I did was considerably more mundane, and, I think, more damning precisely because of how mundane it was. I began collecting my father's mail on my weekend visits, at his own explicit, repeated request, because he'd started expressing a vague, dementia-fogged anxiety about papers piling up that he couldn't quite make sense of. And among that mail, over the following months, I found bank statements for accounts I had never known existed. Statements that Holt, as the financial power of attorney, was legally entitled to receive on my father's behalf, but that my father, as the actual account holder, was also entitled to receive copies of a small bureaucratic overlap that turned out to be the crack Holt's entire arrangement fell through. The house had sold for $412,000. The statements showed the proceeds landing, briefly, in an account in my father's name, for exactly 9 days, before being transferred in 3 separate withdrawals into an account belonging to Holt's Development Company, described in the transfer memo line, in language so thin it was almost insulting, as family loan care expenses. I sat at my kitchen table with those statements spread out in front of me, the same way I imagine I'd once sat with 100 other families' financial disasters laid out for review, except this time the numbers belonged to my own father, and the man who'd moved them belonged to my own family. And I felt, for the first time in this entire ordeal, the specific, cold clarity that I have come to understand, across this whole experience, as the moment fear finally converts into resolve. If you've ever discovered that a small, dismissible unease you'd been carrying for months was actually the shape of your own family quietly stealing from the most vulnerable person in it, you already know exactly the kind of stillness that settled over me at that kitchen table. Stay with me, because what I found next, in my sister's role in all of this, is not what I expected either. Subscribe now so you don't lose this before I get to the guardianship hearing. I want to talk about Vanessa now, because I think her role in this story is different from Holt's in a way that matters, and because I don't want to flatten this into a simple story of one villainous sibling while pretending the other was blameless. Vanessa was not, as far as I was ever able to establish, an active architect of the financial arrangement Holt built. What Vanessa was, and what I came to understand as its own particular kind of complicity, was willfully, carefully uninformed. She had CC'd herself on every care team email specifically, I came to believe, so that she could produce, if ever questioned, a paper trail of her own involvement that required nothing of her beyond forwarding messages she never fully read. She visited my father perhaps once a month, always briefly, always documented in a social media post that generated warmth and sympathy from her followers while requiring from her almost nothing in the way of actual sustained presence. When I finally called her, 3 days after finding those bank statements, and laid out, calmly and factually, exactly what I'd found, her first response was not denial. It was a long, uncomfortable silence, followed by a sentence I have thought about many times since. "I didn't know the specifics," she said. "I knew Holt was handling the money stuff. I figured it was fine because you would have said something if it wasn't." I want to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I think it reveals something important about how families like mine actually function. Vanessa's inaction was not built on trust in Holt specifically. It was built on trust in me, a trust that functioned, in practice, as a kind of outsourced conscience, allowing her to remain comfortably uninformed, because she'd quietly assigned the job of noticing and objecting to the one sibling who could be relied upon to eventually do it, whether or not anyone had actually asked her to. I did not yell at Vanessa on that call. I want to be honest that I felt, underneath my own calm, a real and specific anger toward her, different in shape from what I felt toward Holt, the particular anger reserved for someone who benefits from harm they've carefully avoided understanding closely enough to name. What I told her plainly was that I intended to pursue formal guardianship over our father, that I had documentation of financial exploitation, and that I needed to know directly whether she intended to support that petition or contest it alongside Holt. There was another long silence, and then Vanessa said something that surprised me, something I did not expect and that I've come to believe, cautiously, was genuine. "I'll support you," she said. I should have asked more questions a long time ago. "I'm sorry, Rose." I want to be honest that this apology did not, on its own, resolve years of accumulated family dynamic, and I did not treat it, in that moment, as some clean, complete redemption. But it mattered, practically and emotionally, in ways that became considerably clearer over the following months. And I think it's important to say so, because not every sibling in a story like this ends up in the same place, and Vanessa's willingness to actually look, once I finally forced the looking, is part of what eventually made the legal path forward considerably less brutal than it might have been. I found an elder law attorney the following week, a precise, unhurried woman named Odessa Marchetti, recommended to me by a colleague at the hospice agency who'd navigated a similar situation with her own family years earlier. Odessa reviewed everything I'd assembled, the diner conversation transcribed in my notes app, the cognitive assessment dated 3 weeks before the closing, the power of attorney document with its conveniently interested witnesses, the bank statements showing the transfer to Holt's Development Company, and gave me, in our first meeting, an assessment that reframed the entire scope of what I was actually looking at. "This is not simply a family disagreement about how to manage your father's care," she told me, tapping the bank statements with one finger. "This is documented financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, executed through a power of attorney obtained at a point when his own medical records show diminished capacity to understand what he was signing. Depending on how the district attorney's elder abuse unit wants to handle it, this could carry criminal exposure for your brother, separate and apart from the civil guardianship question. I want you to understand both tracks clearly before we decide how to move." We pursued both tracks simultaneously over the following 4 months, a period I want to describe honestly as the hardest sustained stretch of my professional and personal life combined. Because I was, throughout all of it, still working my full patient caseload, still driving out every weekend to see my father, still maintaining, as best I could, some version of ordinary care and warmth toward a man who had no idea, in his clearer moments, exactly how much upheaval was quietly unfolding around him, and who, in his foggier moments, kept asking, with a specific, heartbreaking persistence, when he'd be going home. I want to describe that specific detail because I think it matters as much as any bank statement. My father had developed, sometime after the house sale, a ritual I did not fully understand the weight of until months into this process. Each evening at Holt's house, before bed, he would pack a small overnight bag, a few shirts, his shaving kit, a framed photograph of my mother he kept on his nightstand, and set it by the front door. When I asked him, gently, what the bag was for, he told me, in the specific, vague but certain way dementia sometimes produces, "In case we go back to the house tomorrow, I want to be ready." Nobody had told him the house was sold. I want to be honest that I don't know, to this day, whether that omission was deliberate cruelty or simply cowardice, Holt avoiding a conversation he didn't want to have. But either way, my father spent months packing a bag every single night for a return that was never going to happen. A bag Holt's own wife, according to what I eventually learned, quietly unpacked and repacked each morning, so my father wouldn't notice its contents growing stale, maintaining, without ever correcting him. The fiction that the house, and the life it represented, was still simply waiting. I found out about the bag on a Tuesday evening visit, 3 months into the guardianship process, and I sat with my father on the edge of his bed at Holt's house while he showed it to me, proudly, the way you'd show someone a job well done. And I understood in that moment, with a clarity sharper than any bank statement had given me, exactly what I was actually fighting for. Not just restitution, not just accountability. The simple, basic right of a man who had raised 3 children and walked the same 6-mile route for 29 years to be told the truth about his own life, gently, by people who loved him enough to say it out loud. I did not correct him that night either. I want to be honest about that. I asked Odessa at our next meeting how to handle it, and she gave me advice I've carried with me since. "There's a difference," she said, "between lying to someone with dementia and choosing, carefully, when and how much truth they're ready to absorb. You're not obligated to correct every misunderstanding immediately, especially not ones this painful. But you are obligated, eventually, once you have stable ground to offer him instead, to tell him the truth plainly, in a place he can actually rest in it." The guardianship petition was filed in September, 5 months after the house sale, built on the full documentary record Odessa, and I had assembled, the cognitive assessment predating the closing, the improperly witnessed power of attorney, the bank statements tracing the transfer directly into Holt's Development Company, and a formal capacity evaluation Odessa arranged through an independent geriatric psychiatrist, confirming, with clinical precision, that my father had lacked the capacity to understand or consent to a major financial transaction at the time the house was sold. Holt, predictably, retained an attorney and contested the petition, a decision that surprised me less than it perhaps should have, given everything I'd already learned about him. But that still landed with a specific, fresh sting when the formal objection arrived, printed on expensive letterhead, characterizing my petition as an unnecessary and hostile family intervention driven by personal resentment rather than genuine concern for the ward's welfare. I want to be honest that reading that sentence, sitting alone in my apartment, made me cry in a way none of the bank statements had. The specific, exhausting grief of watching someone you grew up loving construct, in formal legal language, a version of you designed specifically to make a judge doubt everything you actually knew to be true. Vanessa, true to what she'd told me on that phone call months earlier, did not join Holt's contest. She submitted, instead, a sworn statement supporting my petition, detailing in her own words the pattern of vague, dismissive answers she'd received whenever she'd asked Holt about our father's finances, and acknowledging with what I believe was genuine, difficult honesty, that she had chosen not to press harder because doing so was easier than confronting her own brother. I want to be clear that this statement cost her something real. Holt did not speak to her for the following 3 months, a silence I know weighed on her considerably, given how close the two of them had been for most of their adult lives, and I think her willingness to submit it anyway, knowing what it would likely cost her, represents the actual, meaningful turn in her role in this story, even if it arrived later and more reluctantly than I might have once hoped for. The guardianship hearing itself took place on a gray Thursday morning in November, in a probate courtroom considerably smaller and less imposing than I'd braced myself for, presided over by a judge named Honorable Miriam Castellanos, a woman in her 60s with the specific, weary patience of someone who had clearly presided over more family financial disasters than she'd ever wanted to. I want to walk through the substance of that hearing honestly, because I think the actual mechanics of how it resolved matter more than any single dramatic moment within it. Odessa presented the documentary record methodically, in the same order we'd assembled it: the cognitive assessment, the power of attorneys' compromised witnessing, the bank statements, the independent capacity evaluation. Holt's attorney, a smooth, practiced man who reminded me uncomfortably of the kind of confident deflection Holt himself specialized in, attempted to argue that the house sale proceeds transferred to Holt's development company represented a legitimate, previously agreed-upon loan, one my father had verbally consented to at a time when, Holt's attorney insisted, his capacity had not yet been formally documented as impaired. It was at this point that Judge Castellanos asked a single, precise question that I believe, more than any document in Odessa's folder, actually decided the outcome of that hearing. She asked Holt, directly from the witness stand, to describe the terms of the loan, the interest rate, the repayment schedule, any documentation beyond the transfer memo line itself. Holt hesitated. I watched him hesitate, in a courtroom under oath, in a way I had genuinely never once seen my confident, quick-talking brother hesitate in 39 years of knowing him, and in that hesitation, I think, the entire fiction of a legitimate family loan quietly, visibly collapsed. There was no promissory note. There was no interest rate. There was no repayment schedule. There was $412,000, moved out of a vulnerable man's account 9 days after it landed there, with nothing beyond a single vague line of transfer memo language standing between that transaction and outright theft. Judge Castellanos ruled from the bench, granting the guardianship petition in full, removing Holt as financial power of attorney, and in language I have read many times since, printed in the formal order Odessa framed for me, half as a joke and half, I think, as something she genuinely believed I should keep, finding that the evidence demonstrates a clear pattern of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult by a family member entrusted with his care. She additionally referred the matter, formally, to the district attorney's elder abuse unit for criminal review, a referral that Odessa had warned me, going in, was a real possibility but far from guaranteed, and that landed, when it actually happened, with a specific gravity I hadn't fully braced myself for. I want to be honest about what I felt sitting in that courtroom, watching my brother's face as the ruling was read. It was not triumph, not in any clean or simple sense. It was something closer to a kind of exhausted, grieving relief. Relief that my father's finances and my father's actual well-being were finally, legally, unambiguously in hands that intended to protect them, layered over a real and specific grief for the brother I had grown up believing was simply confident and charming rather than, as I now understood with considerable clarity, someone capable of watching our own father's hand shake around a pen and calling it consent. The criminal case moved considerably more slowly than the guardianship proceeding over the following 7 months, through a process I will not walk through in exhaustive procedural detail here, except to say that the same documentary record that had secured the guardianship, the improperly witnessed power of attorney, the transfer records, the independent capacity evaluation, proved just as decisive in the criminal proceeding. Holt, facing a felony charge of financial exploitation of an elderly person, ultimately accepted a plea agreement, 6 months after the guardianship ruling, involving a suspended prison sentence contingent on full restitution of the $412,000, $5 years of probation, and a permanent bar from serving as a fiduciary or power of attorney for any vulnerable adult in the state. I did not attend the sentencing hearing itself. I want to be honest about that choice, because I think it reflects something true about where I'd actually landed, emotionally, by that point in the process. I had spent 7 months building a case, methodically, patiently, the way I chart a patient's decline, documenting each new symptom without letting myself collapse into the grief of it until the chart itself was complete. Once the plea was finalized, once my father's guardianship was secure, once Odessa confirmed the restitution order was enforceable and being actively garnished from Holt's development company's ongoing revenue, I found that I did not particularly need to watch my brother stand in front of a judge to feel that the actual, meaningful resolution had already happened. What mattered to me, considerably more than that specific room, was the room 40 minutes away, where my father was finally, safely, permanently under the protection of a guardianship order that could not be quietly undone at a kitchen table. I want to tell you about what I did with my father in the months following the guardianship ruling, because I think it matters as much as the legal resolution itself, and because I don't want this story to end with a courtroom rather than with him. I moved him into my own home in December, into the second bedroom I had, months earlier, half-heartedly considered turning into a home office, a plan I abandoned without much regret once it became clear what the room was actually going to be used for instead. I hired a part-time home health aide to cover the hours I couldn't, using funds from the restitution order, which Odessa had structured, with real care, to flow directly into a protected special needs style trust for his ongoing care rather than back into any account he could be pressured to sign away again. I sat with him, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in early January, and finally, gently, told him the truth about the house. I want to describe that conversation honestly, because I think it was, in its own quiet way, the hardest single moment of this entire ordeal, harder than the courtroom, harder than the bank statements. I told him plainly that the house had been sold, that Holt had done something wrong with the money, that a judge had gotten involved to fix it, and that he was safe now, permanently, in a home that was never going to be sold out from under him without his knowledge again. I watched him absorb it slowly, his eyes working through something I couldn't fully follow, and then he asked me, in a small, careful voice, whether that meant he wasn't going to see the house again. I told him the truth. I told him no, he wasn't, and I watched him cry quietly for a few minutes, in a way I let him do without rushing to fix it, because I have learned across 14 years of hospice work that some grief simply needs to be sat with rather than solved. And then, after a while, he wiped his eyes, looked at the framed photograph of my mother that now sat on the nightstand in my guest room instead of Holt's, and said something that has stayed with me every day since. "As long as I'm somewhere your mother would recognize as a home you built out of love," he said, "I think I can let the walls go." That evening, for the first time in 8 months, he did not pack an overnight bag by the door. I noticed it specifically, the way you notice the absence of a sound you'd stopped consciously hearing, but had come to depend on, and I stood in my own hallway for a long moment, looking at the empty space where that bag would have been, feeling something in my chest finally, fully settle. I want to close this out by telling you where everyone ended up, because I think you've earned the full accounting. Holt completed his restitution payments 11 months after the plea agreement, working, as far as I understand, in a considerably scaled-back capacity within his own development company, with a court-appointed monitor reviewing his business's finances as a condition of his probation. We do not speak, beyond the occasional, brief, logistical exchange when something requires it, a medical decision, a shared family obligation neither of us can fully avoid. I have made a specific, deliberate peace with the fact that our relationship, as it existed before any of this, is simply gone, and that whatever comes after, if anything does, will have to be built slowly, on considerably more honest ground than the ground it stood on before. Vanessa and I have grown closer in the month since in a way that surprised me. She comes for dinner most weeks now, and she has become, genuinely and consistently, one of the people actively helping me care for our father, not performatively, not for an audience, but in the unglamorous Tuesday evening way that actually matters. She still occasionally posts about her work online, and I no longer feel the old, sharp resentment watching her do it, because I've watched her, over these months, become someone who shows up in the rooms that don't have cameras in them too. My father, as of this recording, is doing as well as anyone in his situation reasonably can. His cognition has plateaued rather than continued its earlier decline, which Dr. Okonkwo attributes, at least in part, to the stability and structure of his current care. A small, hard-won mercy I try not to take for granted on any given day. He still, most mornings, wakes at 5, 30 out of 30-year habit, and some mornings, when the weather's good, I walk with him around my own neighborhood, a considerably shorter route than the 6 miles he used to cover. And he tells me, sometimes unprompted, that it's a good route, that he likes the light on this particular street. And I understand, hearing it, that he means something larger than the street itself. Here's what I learned, sitting in a probate courtroom watching my own brother hesitate under oath about a loan that never existed. Families can build, over years, a specific, careful architecture of who gets to be trusted with what, who gets to be charming and unaccountable, who gets to be delicate and unquestioned, who gets to be sensible and endlessly available without ever once being formally handed the actual authority that sensibility should have earned. But a vulnerable person's own signature, and a vulnerable person's own shaking hand around a pen, does not particularly care how that architecture was built. It only needs someone patient enough and stubborn enough to notice the crack and to keep documenting until the truth is solid enough to hold real weight in a real room. If you've ever watched a parent or grandparent's trust get quietly exploited by someone your family had always assumed was handling it, this story was for you. Do one thing for me this week. If a vulnerable person in your life has a power of attorney in place, ask to actually see it, ask who witnessed it, and ask, gently but directly, whether they remember and understood what they signed. Comment, the one who kept the bag, if you made it to the end with me, and share this with someone who might need to start asking those questions too. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story, and I'll see you in the next one.